third installation of the Epiq and Valora Technologies AutoClassification 101 series, Follow the Rules. Glad to have you all here. We're going to give it just another minute to give some folks some time to get logged in and settled. While we're doing that, some housekeeping items. All of you will be set to mute on your phones, but as the session goes along, if you're inspired with a question or a comment, please do type it in. We'll be keeping an eye on that during the session, but certainly at the end, we will take note of any questions or comments that were provided and do our best to share them or answer any questions. Just another note, as we've done with our other sessions, at the conclusion of this session, we will be sending an email out to all attendees that includes the slides from this session as well as a link to the recording. And I do believe that that email notification will also include links to the previous sessions, should you want to go back and review those. A note too that we have a slide here that talks about those first two sessions that has a link. Those are not live links here on this version, so please wait for that email to come after. All right, well, I think we're still seeing some folks pop on, but I think, you know, in the interest of time, Sandy, do you want to go ahead and get started, do you think?
Happy to. I'm just going to quickly launch one or two of the polls if people can fill in just quickly a little bit. We'd like to know kind of where you came from and who you are. So as the last couple of people are coming on, please just click that and we'll be happy to share the responses so that you all know kind of who's here.
Great.
So about half of you have indicated who you are. Just get the rest of you come online and kind of tell us who you are and we'll share that. Almost a critical mass. All right, we're going to go ahead and close that poll. So if you haven't sort of voted for what type of organization you're affiliated with, please do so now. And then we're going to go ahead and close that out. So thanks, everybody. And then just one more quick one. Or actually here, I believe I can share the results with you. So you can see a little bit who's here. We got a nice smattering from across the spectrum. So that's who's attending today. And we're going to run one more poll just to quickly let us know sort of what your, essentially what your most pressing data need is. So if you guys could fill that in, just kind of what kinds of data issues or content issues are afflicting your organization. Again, we'll share those results. Obviously, it's all anonymous. All right, about half of you have voted. You guys are quick. Thank you. All right, almost at critical mass. For those who've just joined us, we're just doing a quick poll at the outset to see who's here and what their biggest data concerns are. So please vote if you have not already. Almost hitting critical mass. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close out that poll. If you haven't voted and you want to, please do so. Otherwise, we're going to close that out. And again, I'll share those results with you. And here's what we got today, folks. Kind of definitely heavy preponderance towards the understanding of what data is and maybe defensible deletion of rot. So that seems to be the interest level today. Rules are a very good choice for both of those, so well done. All right, Julie,
Excellent.
Shall we move ahead?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. So Hello again to the new folks who have joined us since we kicked this thing off. I am Julie Colgan with Epiq. Will be your tour guide for this session. This is the third in a series of 4, so there's one more after this one. Let's get started, I think, with introducing ourselves, a good place to start. So, as I mentioned, Julie Colgan, I'm with Epiq. Many folks know me from the records and information management, information governance world. I've spent over 20 years in that space in a variety of capacities, trying to move the ball forward for our profession to make real impacts on the lives of folks who have to deal with information on a daily basis. So excited to be a part of this discussion today, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. Colin, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Absolutely. Thanks, Julie. I'm Colin Cahill. I'm also with Epiq, senior consultant in the records and information management practice. I've been in the industry for a little over 25 years. Generally, I'd say my career has been split both as a consultant and an in-house practitioner, but also split as far as I've worked probably half of my career with law firms and the other half with corporate and government organizations, mostly corporate. And this is a topic that has always been of interest to me, even going back to the late 90s. But it's come to fruition. It's been a lot of fun watching the advance of the technology, and looking forward to sharing what I've experienced with you guys today.
Thanks, Colin. Laura, with your mysterious photo here, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. Hi guys, my name is Laura Machado. I am the product manager of Valora Technologies. I manage Black Cat, which is our data visualization system, and Powerhouse, which you will get a glimpse into today as we talk about rules and how rules affect, a project and corporations and law firms and what they can actually bring to the table. I've been with Valora for over 10 years now, and I've used the software myself. And I use rules on a day-to-day in what I do here in terms of managing projects, in addition to, workflow management and all of that kind of stuff that comes with product management.
Excellent. Thanks, Laura. And last but never least, Sandy.
Thank you, Julie. I'm Sandy Serkis. A bunch of you know me, again, from the industry, like Julie. I'm the president and CEO of Valora, and we are delighted to be bringing this webinar presentation to you all. I'm going to be mostly a quiet party today because Colin and Laura are really going to be running the show, but I'm here to add color commentary, or if people want to hear specifically something from me, by all means, let me know.
Awesome, thanks. All right, flip on to the next slide, if you would. So this, I mentioned the previous session, so we started out with what the heck is AutoClassification, why should I care? The second one, we talked about creating structure from unstructured data, and so for those folks who responded to that second poll and said, understanding the piles of data that you have is of concern for you or of interest, that's a good one if you didn't have an opportunity to join us live to go back and review. And this third session here about rules is really building on those two. And frankly, it's the thing that I'm the most excited about, having been in this industry for longer than I ever anticipated I would be. The thing that's been missing from a technology perspective, at least, is some way to operationalize all of that good insight that we gain through the use of technology to process unstructured data. So, it's one thing to know what you have, but then you've got to be able to take some action. Our world is just becoming quickly flooded with extra stuff, and rules and regulations are changing frequently, and it's, the border walls are almost non-existent in terms of data moving around the world at breakneck speed. And so being able to operationalize our policies against data is super exciting and puts kind of a different game on the table for us. So Sandy, do you want to kind of run down the formal agenda here, and we'll start to get into it?
Sure thing. So as Julie said, we're going to really focus on rules today, which are a task that takes place in an auto classification workflow after that kind of metadata or attribute extraction has occurred. So rules are really, as Julie said, rules are taking action or taking a disposition on different pieces of content, either in an automatic fashion or setting it up for some person to essentially authorize the rest of the workflow. So rules are really where kind of the rubber meets the road. Classification is nice, metadata extraction is nice, it's helpful, it tells you information, but rules are really where things start to happen. So we're going to walk you through some very common use cases where rules would apply. And we're going to take you through some actually specific rules so you can get a feel for what they look like, how they get created, what parameters you have, what depth they go to. And then we're going to talk specifically about what it's like to have rules in play in an enterprise. What some of the gotchas are, how to get this kind of approved through your organization so that you can have these benefits in real day-to-day use as opposed to just theoretical technology that might be available, how to actually use it every day. So that's our plan for the webinar. I'm going to go ahead and start us off. As Julie said, the rules really are the key to unlocking the power of auto classification. It's really where you move from understanding the content that you have to taking action on that content. So actions might be things like removing rot. It might be migrating content to where it needs to belong. It might be actually editing that content and or attributes for issues around privacy and security. And it might be also sending out reporting mechanisms around what the content holds, what it should be, maybe retention scheduling. So there's a lot of different actions that can be taken once the rules are in play. That's why they're so powerful, and we're kind of excited to show you. Okay, so I think I'm going to hand this over to Laura, again, who's the Powerhouse Senior Product Manager, to kind of really talk you through what rules are, how they work, and what you can achieve with them. Laura?
Thank you. So rules are kind of what makes your information valuable. Rules are the things that kind of go through to set you up for success at the end of it. So for this slide right here, we kind of talk you through a little bit of what, a basic rule is. So the rule on the screen, if document type equals contract and the date is less than 2020, mark the file as active. And so what's happening here is the rule system is acknowledging this is kind of like a baby rule. It's like a very low level retention type of rule. And so what this is determining is the document type, which is going to be kind of powered by Powerhouse in the sense the rules engine works with Powerhouse and it kind of acknowledges the metadata concept and the fielded information that we're pulling. So it can recognize that, hey, this is a contract, this date is newer than 2020, so this should be marked as an active file. And this can go in a number of different ways. We can do retention based on date. We can do things about legal hold in the same kind of fashion. So you can see here it says disposition rules can dictate retention, security level, organization, compliance. It's a whole world of information, and it could vary from company to company or corporation to corporation. One of the other things that we use the rules engine for at Valora is for e-discovery type matters. If you're looking to identify privilege, pretty much anything you're looking to gain. What we also use the rules for internally here at Valora is we do a lot of rules to kind of know what's in our data, kind of those world, that poll that was presented earlier. And the big question is what's in our data silos. We can also use rules to kind of give us the first blush of information and kind of like figure out what our world is in terms of data.
Yeah, hey Laura, this is Julie. I'll jump in real quick too. I think importantly on this slide, the potential actions that could result from a rule are the things that get me super excited, right? Because we're talking about scale that we're creating here potentially with the use of technology. As a records manager, I can look at a document and make an assessment of it in relation to a retention policy. But I'm one person with one set of eyes who can only handle one document at a time. There's no way I'm going to be able to deal with the scale and the speed that we really require in a modern business environment. And so particularly around things like routinely getting rid of junk, ephemeral, transitory content by rule will create naturally a cleaner environment for the rest of the stuff that probably has some use in the organization. The other one that I see a lot of interest in is around identifying sensitive information, whether that's sensitive to a company, around trademarks and trade secrets and whatnot, or interest to a person. Those are all things that we just frankly don't have the time to do it manually. And so that's the promise of the rules. And I'm super excited to listen along with everybody as we explore the rest of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Laura, I'd like to jump in with something too here, just pick up on something that Julie said regarding sensitive information. Obviously, GDPR is coming down the pike. If people are not familiar, it's at the end of May, which is really only 2 months away at this point. And not only are we required to identify sensitive information in that context, but to respond to requests within 30 days. So that actually sets a time window on the analysis activity that Julie was just describing. So once you have a limited time window, really you're going to have to get to some sort of automated solution, because as she was saying, the volume of material is so great that frankly there aren't enough humans on Earth to sit there and manually figure out what's in, what's out, or what's sensitive and what's not. And so the notion of automated systems like rules engines are gaining traction in that context. And I'll just put out a plug there. Valora is going to be doing another joint webinar series with Epiq around GDPR. So watch for that specifically coming up, I believe, in April.
Awesome. You want to jump to the next slide?
Absolutely.
So this slide kind of goes through the steps of compliance, and there's a couple different things that we can do with compliance. One of the big ones that we see, of course, is retention. And so the power behind retention is you need to know what of your data you should be retaining, either for legal reasons or for backfiling. And then what type of information you don't want to retain. And retention really plays a key role here, because you don't want to be holding on to or paying for storage for data that you don't need. For data that you would not use in a litigation matter, or just kind of in general, you don't want to have excess data kind of lying around that could potentially cause you problems, even in a litigation world later on down the road. So you want to make sure that your company or your business is establishing data archival requirements in some fashion. And then what the rules can do is they can run against those retention guidelines and give you an idea of, all the data. And this is usually a big surprise for a lot of clients that we see here, is they're surprised that they are retaining so much useless data. And the other thing that we want to make sure is that the company is retaining the things that they're supposed to be retaining. So with these kind of things in mind, you can save your company time and money, protect the company and employees, and easily kind of get access to and search, a relevant database without having all of the conclusion of, things that don't really matter or things that don't need to be retained. We also have here legal hold. And so legal hold, obviously, it's a big one. You want to make sure that your company, again, kind of like retention, you're retaining the things that you need to be ready for any litigation matters that might be coming up. And you want to make sure that you have a proper legal hold system in place, so the correct parties are being notified once a document is put on legal hold, or if you have a specific custodian that is on legal hold, you want to make sure that you're retaining their data. And in that retention of that legal hold data, you want to be able to access it, to be able to export it for, any pending cases. And we happen at Valora, we happen to have production direct from Powerhouse. And then Sandy, I didn't know if you want to talk a little bit about federated security for legal hold.
Sure, and for other things. So one of the things that comes up with this type of technology is, one, of course, the ability to recognize and to identify which files belong under legal hold at kind of one end of the retention spectrum. So at kind of the far end of the spectrum, you have things that need to be kept for long periods of time. Either they're under legal hold, they're a permanent record, or they need to be retained, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. That's kind of at the far extreme of retention. At the complete opposite end, of course, you have rot, stuff you could be getting rid of right now, maybe you could have gotten rid of 10 years ago. Everything else in the middle is under this kind of ticking clock. And so it's a combination of what type of content is it, and that's what you're going to get from the classification part, and how long and how do you need to store that content. That's where we're getting into some of the rules, because different types of content, it's not just the duration that it needs to be kept. There's what type of disposition does it need at the time it expires? Is it quarantine versus automatically deleted versus has to have, an eyes-on decision? And then there's how does it need to be stored all the way along? So if this is sensitive data, either of the variety, like it contains, client date of birth or credit card numbers or, private health information, things like that, or it's sensitive to the organization itself, like this is a list of everybody's salary. So things like that need to have a different type of security mechanism around them. And one of the things that the technique of using rules does is it brings the notion of federation onto the table. So federation is essentially, you can think of that, if you're not familiar with the term, as coordinating activities across. So you have, on the one end, you have different data silos where data lives. And on the other end, you have different use cases. Both of those can be federated if you have an internal engine that is aware of the two ends. So what rules will do is first, kind of determine, hey, this content is sensitive, sort of A, and then B, we need to retain it for, let's say, 10 years. And then C, because it's sensitive and going to be retained, it needs to be locked down. So we're going to apply a security level onto this file and then federate that security throughout the systems so that any Tom, Dick, or Harry trying to access that file, if they don't have permission, they will be prevented. So that's what security federation is. And it ties into, if we have some IT folks on the phone, it ties into your ADFS or sometimes your single sign-on, depending what techniques you have for security at the user layer. That federation becomes a very, very powerful tool across your enterprise.
Yeah, and I think that'll cover, if you click, yeah, that covers most of the privacy and security topics there as well. How we're going to handle that data, if you're going to need to encrypt it, if you need to redact that PII that you're identifying, things of that nature, and of course, GDPR.
One thing I will add to the privacy and security, obviously, in addition to federation, is that there can be multiple storage mechanisms of content, because we get asked this a lot. If we're applying redactions, well, are we sort of destroying the original file? That's always the concern of the e-discovery side of the house. We don't want spoliation. And the answer is the rules are very clever. They can create either one single version that is sort of a truth version of things, or it can have multiple versions depending on who's asking. You hear a little bit of that federation in there. So if a kind of low-level person is asking, they might see a redacted version of content, whereas a high-level person, let's say outside counsel or someone in the legal department or HR, is going to see the unredacted flavor. So again, Powerhouse and systems like it are tracking the different versions and the different federations of those versions. Okay, and I don't see any questions coming up, so hopefully that was very clear to everybody.
Well, I'll say this, Sandy, we could spend days talking about all of the stuff behind this. Where I think everybody really wants to get is what we have in the second half of this deck. So I would suggest we kind of push through these kind of front slides setting the stage so we can get to the good stuff.
Okay, so the next one here, we kind of covered this a little bit already, where you're going through and you're identifying rot. So rot is redundant, obsolete, and trivial. It's junk files. One of the other things that's really important when it comes to kind of taking a step back and looking at your data is identifying what type of duplicates you might have. So there's a couple different types of duplicates you might have. The first one most people know about, it's exact electronically forensic hash match files. These are files that are the same exact hash value. The other two types of duplicates kind of get overlooked sometimes. So functionally identical duplicates are usually based off 99% text-based similarity. And then you have nearly duplicate, which is around 75 to 98. So one of the key things about functionally identical dupes, which is that 99% group, is that'll kind of give you a little bit more information about, what types of documents that you might be calling, or that might be different just based off one little identifier. So it's kind of nice to have all three different flavors available to you, so you can kind of get a better idea of what your data is. The other bullets here we've kind of already gone through: PII, relevance, just quickly for priv and legal hold. That's more prominent in e-discovery world. And then from then you can kind of decide what needs remediation. What might not have quite the metadata that we need, or do we want to do some other comparisons? And we can do all of this stuff within the rules. And so disposition, these are where the action happens. So disposition and action, kind of interchangeable here. So not only do you have defensible deletion, but as Sandy mentioned, you might have documents that you need to quarantine or hold on to for 10 years or more. Some of the other nice options that we do have here are things like tombstones. And what a tombstone is once you've removed the file from the system, we can identify what needs to have like a tombstone or a place marker left where that file was then removed from the system. Redaction, again, a bunch of these things. These are the actions that happen with the rules we've kind of already talked about. So here is the universe of, the 10 use cases for auto classification. Again, lots of things that we can do here between remediation, migration, monitoring for compliance. Sandy, I didn't know if you wanted to add any other types of use cases that might not be on here, or talk this through a little bit.
Basically, what I would add to that is that we've put this slide up so far every time because we believe strongly in auto classification, and we see so many different use cases. The reason that we have it here is because now that you're beginning to understand what rules really do, hopefully these start to really take shape. Again, it's one thing to classify something, it's quite another to literally take these actions with the software. And so that's why we've kind of presented it here, to show you that behind every single one of these, the rules engine is actually carrying out that disposition. So we're going to get really into it now, where we kind of say, all right, rules, let's put you to the test. We've maybe already extracted out a bunch of metadata and a bunch of attribute data about each of these files. What are you going to do about that? So we're going to take you now for a deep dive into the rules. And I will let Julie kind of discuss the different kinds of rules and how we think about it when we're setting up a rules-based project.
Yeah, great. So I kind of coined this phrase a few years ago: search and rescue versus seek and destroy. When you think about all of the actions that you want to take, they'll fall under one of those buckets, right? So it's either something that you want to get rid of for whatever reason, either it's met its retention requirements, or it's junk, or in your way, or it's something that you need to go and find and do something with, whether that's retain it or redact it or secure it or whatever that may be. And so thinking through really what you're trying to accomplish with your initiative is important. And beyond saying, all right, is this something that we're ultimately going to seek to dispose of, and what goes with that? Is it something that we are going to need to keep, and I'm going to need other folks to be involved, right? Are there other stakeholders, IT, for example, legal, for example, that will need to be part of that conversation and help rally the resources needed to be successful in what we're trying to do? So that's kind of, identifying those end goals and then gathering some relevant information about what are the data sources, where is the stuff found, who has physical control over it or compliance control over it, then even in a more granular sense, you have to think through really the complexity of the data that you're likely to encounter as part of the project. How inclusive ought we be? Is there anything that we can exclude and should exclude? Does it have to be either or is there some gray area that we're comfortable with? Within the data itself, not just thinking at a high level, but what original metadata exists? Is there any enrichment in the system where it resides or elsewhere? Obviously, considering the content within the item itself. Some other things you'll want to work through are, what if there is something that the system just can't make sense of? What are you going to do with that, and how would you handle that? And being comfortable in assigning a level of confidence or agreeing to a level of confidence that the technology is able to achieve as a result. And so again, that's one that I've found in these exercises where organizations sometimes get stuck is some parts of the organization, some stakeholders in these projects expect 100% confidence, which we all know, data is too dirty, too fast, too big to be 100%. And so, anticipating that and thinking through it and getting consensus in your organization will be important as you get started. Colin, I think you should say something. How about this one?
Oh, thanks, Julie. Yeah, so the art of rules creation. As I'm sure you might imagine, there's a lot of science and math behind this sort of technology. But when you get to applying the rules and creating the rules, it really does start to become a bit of an art. So once you've surfaced all that information, whatever you're looking at, now what do you do with it, right? And I would hope and expect that anyone who started to embark on one of these projects would first think about, as we've already kind of talked about, what are your goals? Is this a remediation project where you're looking to remediate a file server, or is this a project where you're looking to perhaps extract some valuable content that you think could be buried and missing in there? So understanding what your goals are, what assumptions you might have. One might assume that you'll expect to find a large number of duplicates, for example, or perhaps there's some sensitive content that could be buried and not being protected as it should. And it's really the rules that support the goals and validate the assumptions. And certainly initially, the creation of the rules is probably going to be the most time-consuming element in this project initially. That being said, there is no magic number, but at some point, as you're going through your content, you're going to get to a point where you've learned probably about as much as you're going to learn, and maybe that's once you've worked through 20% of the content, or again, there's no magic number, but at some point you will. Getting to that point can be somewhat time-consuming, but once you get there, then the rest tends to go a little bit faster. So during those initial phases with the rules, you will absolutely be tweaking rules that you've created. So you'll probably be deleting rules you created, editing them, and certainly creating new rules. And every time you do that, you're going to want to look at change your views of how you're looking at the data, how you're presenting that data, and it's an important exercise. One of the things that I think most organizations would find too is, as you're doing that, you'll likely find some unexpected insights. So an example of that could be, as you're peeling the layers back on some of this unstructured content, you're going to start to see how users have named their content, how what sort of document names, folder names are they using, and perhaps there are some common themes there. And let's continue the example and say a managed repository that you have, you may not have the adoption rate that you'd really like. Well, an unexpected insight could come from this project where you say, now I have some additional insight into the nomenclature and taxonomy that the folks are using on a file share, and perhaps we could leverage that to enhance user adoption in our managed repository. So being open to those sorts of opportunities, I think is something that I was surprised at initially, but a lot of value there, and it's part of the art as well. Also, as you're working through rules, I would say that there's a certain skill set that is good to have. So it's certainly an analytical skill and process, problem-solving skills, and skills at doing research are things that I think, three that I have found to be most useful. So if you're thinking about who could support a project such as this, finding folks with those skill sets would probably be a good place to start as well. So you really, again, so my key takeaways on the art of rules creation is you certainly do want to increase the focus on the content, drilling down as deeply as you can, but it's equally as important to occasionally step back and take a more holistic view of the data and as you're parsing through it. So it truly is an art, and I think Laura will get into more of the algorithms that go behind setting up the rules and the actions that they take.
Awesome. All right, Laura.
All right, so here we've got three kind of different ways to think about rules. And so these are just kind of ideas and how your organization might be able to kind of classify the data. So on the first side here, we have what's called bucket rules. And so bucket rules are when you have kind of large categories of information. Something that might be a bucket rule is like, you're looking for a certain geographic. Is this international? Is it domestic? Your business might revolve around different categories of things. So these might be something like, if you primarily work in procurement or in something like that, you might be looking for where your products are smuggled or counterfeited. So that might be a type of category. And then you're also looking for, what else might be in your data. So a lot of clients right now are looking for like matter, name, and number. This is kind of big in law firms. But so if you're looking to identify a matter number, you're looking to classify data by one large bucket, and then within that bucket you have other classifications that you can identify. Another way to think about rules is much more granular. So bucket is kind of the big categories, heavy hitters that you can kind of utilize, and then end node rules is based more on like a taxonomy, something where you're getting really, really specific, really granular. And so you might see this in something like if you'd like to file all of your agreements or all of your vendor contractor work in a certain file location, that's something that can also be determined by rules. So, that might go as low as, the example on the screen is administrative, vendor management, contracts, scopes of work. We typically recommend that companies, at least in today's day and age, don't go so granular, because what we like to think about with the rules is how it sets up your business standards. So it's always kind of good to go from the large buckets and then kind of drill down a little bit from there instead of going super granular, because it's a lot more upkeep and it's a lot more complex for the end user later. And then the last kind of bucket here is fairly new. So this is data-driven rules. Data-driven rules, they're fantastic, let me just say, because it changes the world of rules. So before we had data-driven rules here at Valora, we typically used the bucket or the end node kind of scenario. But what data-driven rules lets us do here is it allows us to pull information. And so this might be information in a conflicts database, or it might be something as simple as a table, like an Excel spreadsheet of information. And so what the data-driven rules allow us to do is to take that pulled information or the spreadsheet and convert that to rules without having to do a lot of manual effort. So what I mean by that is the information that's gathered for these rules generates themselves. So to use the example of matter name again, or matter number, what we would then kind of see in a world is the rule replicates itself based on the quantifiers for your matter number. So that might be something like the parties mentioned on the document, attorneys working on it, specific locations, or something like keywords or phrases. And so what the rules then do is, again, it replicates itself in a way that makes sense per matter number. Definitely the way to go. It's kind of Valora's step into, machine learning, that sort of thing. But it's a really great addition because that also means that people who are more laymen's don't really need to know a lot of information to get data going. You don't necessarily have to be an SME, but of course that helps, or to have an SME's input. But it also means that you don't really need a technical background. Before we kind of had what we call in our house the rules editor, which is just like a graphical user interface. You had to know regex and you had to know code to be able to generate rules or build a rule system. And so these new ways for rules, you'll see it once we kind of dive into the rules editor screenshots here. But this really changed the way things worked at Valora, and I'm sure that they could be applied elsewhere. So that's really the beauty of kind of how the rules affect you and how they affect the data.
Yeah, hey Laura, real quick before we're about to show kind of the details. So go ahead and flip it. I think in my experience doing projects like this, this view is what people go, oh my goodness. And so I think it's a responsible thing to say in this this webinar that while rulemaking is becoming easier and it's the promise of things like machine learning and predictive analytics and all that kind of good stuff, it's not for the faint of heart, and it needs to be taken seriously and should be done by somebody with the right skills, as Colin mentioned. So for those who are looking at the screen going, oh my goodness, this doesn't make sense to me, Laura's going to walk us through it. It's not really as scary as it might look, but it is a serious business. And again, the promise of rules is not just one time deciding something, but operationalizing your decision-making and policy application over time and over different sets of data. And so getting the rules right up front is worth your time and investment. So I'll stop talking and go for it.
I mean, definitely. You want to make sure, especially when you're thinking of rules in a world of compliance, obviously it's not just going to be someone coming in and just pulling things out of the air. Definitely when you're looking at things like compliance and data and security, you want to make sure that you know your stuff. And so what you see here is a screenshot of our rules editor system. And so this is kind of an example of something that's a little bit more complex and granular. So what you'll see here on the left side is this is kind of where the summary is. This is kind of the summary pane. So whoever's creating rules can kind of take a look at this and kind of see what information we're pulling and what we're pulling from. And a lot of the information that we pull from is the metadata, and not just the electronic metadata, but also any type of enriched metadata that's available on the document. So just because the document was last modified, yesterday, somebody might then change the actual date, if it's a letter template, to today because they anticipated mailing out that letter today. So other things to kind of keep in mind here is that we can use any sort of fielded information in addition to the content of the document. So we can utilize storage locations, custodians, things of that nature that might not necessarily be mentioned in the document itself, but kind of come with the data. And then what you'll see on the right side in this particular example is this, like one of the operations. So in this case, this is a values list. And so in the values list, you can set up different weights and confidences and kind of get that hierarchical decisioning happening on your data. The other thing that we can do here is reference files. So because this is a values list, you can also have a list of values by ticking off that files button right there. And then if we want to dive into the more complicated screenshot, that kind of explains it a little bit more. So here's another screenshot of the rules editor. And again, so this is a less complex environment. So you'll see that we don't have quite so many rules and there's a little bit more organization in here. So this is what we're talking about when we had the other slide, which was the 3 different ones, if you want to do bucket or complex. This one's a little bit more of the bucket nature. So I'm grouping things on the screen right now. You can see that we're grouping by geographic. that sort of thing. The nice thing about this screenshot is it shows you the operations tab. And so what happens here on this operations tab on the right is this is where all the things kind of happen. So this is where you can set up your testing. So we have a couple different things that we can look for here. One of the drop-down box that's kind of in the center there is the match type. And match type is really important because this is going to denote the operation that the rules are going to run against. So you can search for things like exact if you're looking for exact matches, but then you have a couple options there too, where if you want to ignore case or punctuation, again, you can get pretty complex or pretty basic depending on what you're actually looking for. Some of the other things, the nice things that you can do with rules is you can word stem them. So one of the things that you used to have to do with rules is you'd have to kind of go through and think of all the different synonyms or things like that, like for example, using the word by. So if I want to identify documents that mention the word by, if I'm using a word stem operation, I can then identify bys, bought. If I have a specific word stemming file, I can also then include purchase, purchased, and all different iterations of the word. So word stemming kind of opens up the gates a little bit when it comes to manual interactions with the rules editor and the rules engine itself. And we've got a couple other different things, clever things that we can do. One of the ones that we see a lot of use of is our date identifier. And so what that allows us to do is, especially for retention-based projects, is we can identify date ranges. If your retention, requires documents to be within a certain period, we can do that. We can identify documents that are before or after a certain period, things of that nature. And then what we can also do is we can identify what field we want to identify things on. Because again, we might not be interested necessarily in the body content, but maybe we're really interested in who the custodian was or what file share this file was located on. So we can run these types of rules across any type of information that we might have, be it body content or any type of fielded information we can pull from the document. And then again, we mentioned with the field list, we can use files, we can set weights, a lot of different things we can do. One of the things that's kind of not included in this screenshot here is, again, that data-driven rules that I mentioned earlier. And so in a data-driven rules world, and this is why we don't have many screenshots of it, is you'll see on the left that there are quite a bunch of different rules. So in each rule, there's a separate string test, and there's a couple other neat things that we can do, like with attachment ranges and family ranges and so on. But with a data-driven rule, what that looks like is it will have a single rule, and that is it. Because what it's doing is it's reading the pulled information from your conflicts database, or it's generating the information on a spreadsheet itself. So it's not quite as complex, and that's why there's not a lot of screenshots of it, but that's just another example of what the rule system can kind of do. So again, advanced rules. So here we're going to have some screenshots of kind of what we do for a retention or a legal hold scenario. Again, I've already kind of talked through data-driven rules. So if you just want to click through to have the little image come up, Sandy. So this right here is going to show us a retention rule. And so what we'll have is we have a retention policy. So obviously this is a mock-up retention policy, and it's pretty basic for the proof of this demo. So what we have here is we're basing our retention guidelines on what the document type is. And again, that's not file extension. We prefer to use a little bit more information that's available in the document. So just because it's a PDF file, it could be a letter, it could be a memo, it could be a report, it could be a financial. It just gives us a little bit more information. So we're basing our retention example here on document type, and then you'll see the minimum requirements for how long that we have to store it. So if you click one more time, it should show you how that table then translates into rules. So in this case, we're identifying two separate things. We're identifying the expiration date. So that would be the doc date plus 3 years or 10 years, depending on where it falls on the table. And then we're also kind of dictating here how we're going to handle that file when the expiration comes. So this is used in our Powerhouse demo for any of you who have seen that. So what this is showing you is how we will then handle it. Will this be deleted? Are we going to quarantine? Does this type of document never expire? And then what Powerhouse does, so that's the rules engine in play, and then what Powerhouse will do is it'll action that item out. So if this item is selected for defensible deletion, it will then delete it, compile all the appropriate reports, generate a tombstone if that's part of it, and then carry on its job. What the rules also do is it will constantly pull. So in the world of the data-driven rules, you have your conflicts database. The rules will constantly pull to make sure that it is up to date with your, your business standards. And then if you want to click through, we also have a similar rule for legal hold. So in this example, legal hold, and again, it's really basic. We're going to have our quantifier. Here's our current legal hold criteria. We only really care about, Sally Smith and Jane Doe. And so what the rules will show you is we are looking for documents that have the custodian of Sally Smith between the date ranges that are listed on the document. And then you can kind of see here in this little example that we have nested values. So you can have, or values, and if it's pretty much like if, or, and then. So it kind of, you have to string things together. So you can have all of a quantifier, or you can have or quantifiers. So it really kind of gives you, it opens up the whole world to being as complex or as basic as you really need it to be. So in this case, this example is a little bit basic, but you can imagine how it would expand if you have a little bit more qualifiers.
Laura, a question's come in that I'm hoping you can answer because it's apropos here, particularly when we're talking about things that have a date window on them. And the question was asking about doc date, since that's the phrase that we're using, for example, right here. And the question is that date last modified, date created, date finalized? Can you speak to that?
Yes, absolutely. So when we say doc date, at least for Valora, what we're talking about is the date on the document. So that is not the date modified. It's not the date created. It's actually the date on the document. So I mentioned a little bit how if you have a PDF, that PDF could really be a number of things. So an example of a letter, usually letters have a date somewhere in the top right. So that's not the date that the user created it, and it's not the date that it was printed, but it's specifically the date that's just on the document. So that's kind of what we mean by doc date. And we can set up rules. Most people base their retention rules actually on last date modified or date created. So you can get really complex or really basic depending on what you're looking for in your data. We can identify a number of dates, last mod, last created, last saved, date the email was sent. There's tons of electronically available dates available. So we could use any of those really to base it off that.
Well, I think that's part of the challenge that I've experienced in doing these kinds of projects is choosing which date is going to be the best date to get the result we're looking for. And that's going to vary depending on what use case you've got at hand. So sometimes modified date is the right one. Sometimes the create date. So the good thing about these technologies is they can see these dates in the first place, and they're available to build into rules that take into account what you're trying to accomplish and the content that's available. Good stuff. Good question. Dates are tricky. It's one of those things you got to think through. Hey, Colin, how about taking a stab at this one?
Yeah, sure. So wanted to kind of quickly walk through a real life case study in using this sort of technology. So, and this is my experiences in a past life. So the example is with a large corporate organization that had been around for many years, had over 500 terabytes of content on network file shares. No one really knew very much what was in there. It was the one or the top thing that kept the general counsel awake at night. And it was commonly referred to by the CEO and others as a woodpile and a hairball. So people knew it was an issue. There were certainly concerns, but no one really knew how to try and start to unravel that hairball. So what we did is we brought in an information governance tool, an auto-classification tool. We started out by having a proof of concept. So we defined some of the things that we wanted to prove with this proof of concept. We targeted a subset of that 500 terabytes of content, and we got the tool, got to kick the tires around. We were able to pretty quickly, within about 30 days, prove everything that we wanted to prove going into the proof of concept. Got to get familiar with the tool itself. That convinced the organization enough to make the purchase of the tool. We were then still left with the obstacle of, my God, we still have 500 terabytes. How are we going to do this? And it wasn't just, as we started to get closer to taking some action, it wasn't just the sheer volume. We started running into some cultural issues as well. So, you probably wouldn't be surprised. There was a lot of sensitivity and ownership of content, even though a lot of, no one really knew what the hell was there. People were very protective of sort of their little spaces and what their content was. What we were able to do is, rather than try and eat the entire apple in one bite, was to just start with little nibbles at the apple. And the first nibble where we were able to really start to get traction was, and from the outset, our ultimate goal was remediation of this 500 terabytes. So the first nibble was, we identified some rot. Duplicates were something that during the proof of concept, we saw that we had almost 60% of the content were duplicates. So that was a little bit alarming. So we certainly wanted to try and identify 99% dupes and delete those. We identified other rot as well. We were able to get buy-in from executive leadership. We got very little pushback from business owners and content owners with that approach. And from a resource perspective, it really was, we built the rules to look at, identify that rot, tag it, and then take action on it. And we really didn't have to involve or impact the business hardly at all. It was really just a very small team of folks that were doing running the rules and doing the analysis and taking that action. And we were able to work through a large volume of that content pretty quickly. And along the way had identified a few of those sort of unexpected insights and use cases as well. So the moral of the story is, as we've kind of shown you guys, there's a lot involved here. These can be enormous efforts, but the best way to approach it successfully is to take those baby steps and identify the problem, the goals, the drivers, divide that up into the small steps, start to take actions that you can gain success with. I know we're
we're right up at the time, so I'm going to jump back in. And we didn't have a ton of other questions. We did have one asking about whether or not the slides would be available, and before folks drop off, we'll be sending an email to all attendees that will have the slides and links to the recordings of all sessions so far. Speaking of that, we have one more to go after this one. Sandy and I are going to put on our seer hats and pull out our crystal balls and talk about things that we see coming down the pike, and I'm excited about that one. So please keep an eye out for that invitation and come join us for a good time. I do wonder where my flying car is. I would love it. And with that, I'll thank everybody again, the panelists and all of the attendees. I fully expect that this wet your whistle, and there's tons of questions that are flying through your head. So if that's the case, feel free to contact anyone at Valora or anyone here at Epiq, and we're of course always happy to hear what you have going on and share some insights that may help you get moving forward. So again, thanks for your time. Thanks for your content and insights, panelists, and everybody have a great day. Be safe out there.